Hello! Today we're gonna go through all types of SE in Spanish. If you're new to this channel, hola! Welcome! And no, I'm not gonna show you my nipples. For the past a lot of time, we've been talking a lot about SE in Spanish. I've made a bunch of videos where we went deep on all types of SE, and today it's time to review everything we've learned and finally acknowledge the fact that the SE in Spanish is no longer your enemy. Today, SE in Spanish will become your bitch. Like I said, today we're only gonna briefly review everything we've been working on SE in Spanish. So if you feel like you need to refresh your memory, I suggest you go and watch all 6 videos that we've been working on. Or don't. I mean, you'll figure it out. Now, let's begin. What you see on the screen right now is 5 examples of SE in Spanish that we've learned. Pause the video and try to identify each type of SE. The sentence number 1 is called Impersonal SE. The sentence number 2 is Passive Voice SE. Number 3 is Reflexive SE. Number 4 is, well, nobody really knows how it's called, but I call it se le les. I'll explain why later. And the last sentence is Accidental Reflexive SE. If you got most of them right, just look at yourself. A couple of months ago, you thought that all this SE bullshit will never make sense to you, and now you are able to see the difference between most of them. It wasn't easy, but we got here. I'm proud of you. Now we're gonna go into each one of these examples and briefly discuss what's what, to make sure we're on the same page. Example number 1, Impersonal SE. Se trabaja mejor sin distracciones. First of all, how do we know it's Impersonal SE we're talking about here? I hope you remember that Impersonal SE is a structure that is used for generalizing our experiences without referring to a specific person. In English, we simply use one or they as a generic subject. The rule for Impersonal SE is se plus verb conjugated in the third person singular form. Only singular, that's important. Knowing all that, we can translate our current sentence as one works better without distractions, or they work better without distractions, or it's better to work without distractions. It doesn't matter which translation you choose. The only thing you need to understand is that in general, working is better without distractions. We're not talking about anyone specific. Here's the video for you on the subject of Impersonal SE. The second type of SE is Passive Voice SE. The example we have is Se escribieron los libros en español. Shit, now we have to talk about active and passive voice again. So, when we use active voice, we say I wrote the books in Spanish, which follows the logic subject, action, object. But in passive voice, we have it all reversed. We say the books were written by me, which makes it object, action, subject. There's 2 ways to form passive voice in Spanish. When we know who the subject is, me in this case, we have to use the rule ser plus verb in the past form plus por, and you add the subject. For example, los libros fueron escritos por mí, which means the books were written by me. This is precisely how we say it in English, which makes it easier. But sometimes we don't know who the subject is. In that case, we can use a different type of structure, that is se plus the verb conjugated in a third person singular or plural form. So our original example, se escribieron los libros en español, can be translated as the books were written in Spanish. We don't know who wrote them, but it's not important sometimes. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is the rule for Impersonal SE. And here we have passive voice SE. Almost the same stuff, isn't it? The passive voice SE literally works the same way as Impersonal SE, except it can allow verbs being used in the plural form. So what exactly is the difference? Well, yes, both of them are used in a generic way, meaning that we don't have a subject who performs an action. It's tricky because in some cases they are almost indistinguishable. There's 2 tricks to help you out. For example, Impersonal SE is more used to describe something generic, such as a custom, a tradition, or a rule. For example, se puede nadar en el lago. Se come muy bien en México. Notice how we don't have any objects here, or rather, we are not performing any action on any object. We simply state the fact that one can swim in a lake and one eats well in Mexico. But with passive voice SE, it's more about an action being done to the object, which is not what we usually have in Impersonal SE. For example, se habla español en este pueblo. Se gasta mucho dinero en el mercado. In these 2 sentences, the Spanish and money are used as objects to have the actions done to them. We just don't know by whom. The most confusing part in all this is the fact that, for example, the sentence se habla español en este pueblo can be translated as both passive voice se, which is the Spanish is spoken in this town, but also one speaks Spanish in this town, like in general, which is an impersonal se. If you look at both of these translations, you will realize that they mean the same thing. The same can be said about the second sentence. We can say lots of money is spent in the market, which is a passive voice se. Or we can choose impersonal se translation and say one spends a lot of money in the market. That's why I encourage you to just relax and let the language flow into you. The second trick for you is to always check the grammar, or rather if the verb that goes after se is used in a singular or plural form. For example, you can say se vende el coche, which can be translated as one sells the car if you go impersonal se route, or the car is sold here if you choose to translate it as a passive voice se, which is essentially the same thing. But look what happens once I modify the sentence to look like this. Se venden los coches. Here you don't have to worry about anything. According to the rule, when the verb that follows se is used in a plural form, it can only mean that we have a passive voice se, which can only be translated as the cars are sold here. And if I modify this sentence one last time, we may have something like this. Se vende los coches. Here it cannot be a passive voice se, because in order to have a passive voice se, the verb has to match the object. Se vende is a third-person singular form, and los coches is third-person plural form. So if we try to translate it as a passive voice se, we would have the cars is sold here, which is grammatically incorrect in both Spanish and English. In this case, we can only translate it as one sells the cars, which is an impersonal se. Please, try not to worry too much about it. As long as the grammar is correct, just pick one translation and you'll be fine, because in most cases it doesn't matter. With the time, you'll get better at this, I promise. Sorry if I spent too much time on this. The confusion between impersonal and passive voice se is a very well-known topic that doesn't get enough coverage online. I hope I didn't confuse you too much. Here are two videos where we go deeper into passive voice se and the comparison between it and the impersonal se. Okay, now let's jump into the next type of se, which is a reflexive se. The example we have is Edward se despierta a las 10 cada día, which means Edward wakes up at 10 every day. Now, reflexive verbs are verbs where the subject and the object are the same entity, which means that the current sentence can also be translated as Edward wakes himself up at 10 every day. Please, don't forget that the infinitive form of any reflexive verb has se attached to it, just like we have it with the current example of despertarse. But it doesn't mean that all reflexive verbs use se as a reflexive pronoun. If we take the same verb despertarse and conjugate it for all subjects, what we get is me despierto, te despiertas, se despierta, nos despertamos, se despiertan. As you can see, when we talk about reflexive se, we are only referring to the third-person singular and plural forms, which are él, ella, usted, and ellos, ellas, ustedes. Here are more videos about reflexive verbs and their different types. The next type of se is something that I call se le les. I will explain in a second. This type of se appears only when we are using both direct and indirect object pronouns at the same time. Direct object is a noun that answers the questions what or whom, and indirect objects answer the questions to whom or for whom. I hope you remember that. For example, Carmen me compró los regalos means Carmen bought me the gifts. Here the gifts is the direct object because it answers the question what. And me is an indirect object because it answers the question to whom. Now let's replace our direct object with its corresponding direct object pronoun, that is los. The sentence becomes Carmen me los compró. Looks simple, right? Now let's try to imagine that Carmen decided to buy gifts for every possible subject that exists, which will only require us to change the indirect object pronoun. So let's do it. What we have is Carmen te los compró, Carmen le los compró, Carmen nos los compró, Carmen les los compró. If you've been a good student, you should be able to easily spot two errors on a screen. Like I mentioned in the previous videos, there's only one rule that you need to remember when it comes to combining direct and indirect object pronouns. That is, when the pronouns le and les are followed by lo, la, los or las, we have to change le or les to se. We cannot say Carmen le los compró, nor we can say Carmen les los compró. The correct way to handle this is to replace le and les with se. So what we have is Carmen se los compró. I call this type of se le les, meaning that the se you see on the screen only exists here to replace le and les, because for some reason there's no such thing in Spanish as combining le and les with lo, la, los or las. The only confusing thing here is that now we don't know which se replaces le and which replaces les, meaning that we don't know for whom did Carmen buy the gifts. The way to clarify that is to simply add the original subject. For example, Carmen se los compró a él, ella o usted. Or Carmen se los compró a ellos, ellas, o ustedes. Spanish can be repetitive sometimes, I know. More information about direct and indirect objects and se, le, les can be found in these videos. Ah shit, almost forgot. The example from the beginning of the video on se, le, les was se lo garantizo, which means I guarantee it to him, her, you, or them. Now I hope you can see that the pronoun se here exists only because it's simply replacing le or les. Depends only on the context. We're almost there. The last type of se is the accidental reflexive se. Now, this is the hardest type of se to understand, but only if you don't know how other types of se work. As long as you have a good understanding of reflexive verbs and the indirect object pronouns, accidental reflexive se should not cause much trouble. The example we have is se te está quemando la tostada, which means your toast is burning. The most important thing to understand here is that the whole situation of toast burning is an accident, even though we're not explicitly saying por accidente. The way we know that this is happening by accident is because the structure you see on the screen follows the rule se, then indirect object pronoun, such as me, te, le, nos, les, then conjugated verb, and the noun, which is a definition of accidental reflexive se. It is a fancy structure that helps us sound smart when things don't go according to plan, instead of just adding por accidente every time. Now let's try to break down the sentence to understand it better. Step 1. It all starts with the fact that the toast is burning. Se está quemando la tostada. Here we are using the reflexive verb quemarse. So now all we have to do is to add an indirect object pronoun te in order to indicate that the whole toast burning fiasco is happening to you. And the way it's done is by placing te between se and the verb, in this case está quemando. So what we have is se te está quemando la tostada, which is translated as your toast is burning. And the way we know it was an accident is because the literal translation of this structure is the toast is burning on you, which is a nice way of saying that you're stupid for being on TikTok while cooking. Here's the video where we discuss accidental reflexive se in detail. Oh god, I think we did it. How are you doing? Good stuff, eh? This is the video I originally wanted to make many months ago, but I realized that it would take me 3 hours to cover everything. So I decided to make a bunch of smaller videos to go deep in each type of se. And this video today is just an overview of everything we've been working on. Now that we are finally done with se, I think it would be a good idea to cover, I don't know, everything in Spanish. I know how it is to be a beginner, so I think together we'll be able to make more sense out of everything. While I'm preparing for the future videos, I want you, yes, you, to let me know down in the comments below everything that's bothering you in Spanish, everything that's challenging or complicated for you. I will do my best to help you, and if for some reason I can't, I will send you to someone else. All the links are in the description. Thank you for watching.